So I'm going to start with land acknowledgement. So today I'm joining you from Fairmont Hot Springs, which is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Ktunaxa and the Secwepemc Nation. If you want, feel free to put in the chat where you're from and what your land acknowledgement is, if you happen to know that. I also want to acknowledge that Living Lakes Canada's work originated in the Columbia Basin, which is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Ktunaxa, the Secwepemc, Liautané, Sinixt, and Syilx. So I'm going to start with a bit of an overview of what we're going to talk about today. And as I said, we have about an hour to go through the session here. We're going to go through some introductions of the folks from Living Lakes that are with us. I'm going to talk about why water and why monitoring. And this is where I'm going to ask you some questions, some polling information as well. Go over some of the programs that Living Lakes has currently operating in the area, and then we're going to walk through a Columbia Basin Water Hub live tour, and then some wrap up and questions from there. So for introduction's sake, that's me, Wendy Booth. So I work on a contract basis with Living Lakes Canada about local government outreach and communication and that sort of thing. I know, Roberta and Susan and Rob actually quite well, but Judy, I don't think I've ever met you, so this is probably more for your benefit. But I was a former director with the Regional District of East Kootenay for about 10 years, on the board of Columbia Basin Trust for a number of years as well. I was president of UBCM as well, and I'm currently work as a consultant on community development projects, nonprofit work through the Nonprofit Advisors Program, and community development and strategic planning, board governance, that sort of thing. Also with me today, we have Maggie, who her picture's on here, and I don't think she's back yet into the room. She's going to come back momentarily. So Maggie grew up along the shores of Prince Edward Island, and is having never been further west than Ontario, she packed her bags and moved to the Kootenays in 2015. She completed her recreation, fish and wildlife program at Selkirk College, which fostered her love for the diverse landscapes of the province. She went on to achieve her GIS advanced diploma and did her co-op with the Columbia Basin Watershed Network. She moved north to do consulting work, utilizing her skills as an environmental technician, before eventually working as an archaeological company in Fort St. John in their GIS department. She now resides in Prince Edward Island and is still working for Living Lakes Canada, supporting the GIS and database needs. She's going to be walking us through the demonstration of the Columbia Basin Water Hub platform later in the session. So we also have Nicole Trake on the call here, and Nicole is an accredited journalist with an award-winning editor whose 20-plus-year communications career has spanned multiple sectors and roles. Her passion for natural landscape and wildlife has led her to the environmental nonprofit sector. Prior to joining Living Lakes Canada full-time, Nicole was the communications manager for the Kootenay Conservation Program and worked as an independent contractor for other environmental organizations, including the Columbia Mountains Institute of Applied Ecology and Columbia Wetlands Stewardship Partners. She holds an honors BA in History and International Relations from the University of British Columbia, and is a graduate of Langara College Department of Journalism post-degree program. And Nicole will be helping with the slide deck in the back end and doing some polls. We are going to have some interactive polls in today's session, and supported me in developing this program. So next up, I'm going to talk about a few different of my experiences in my role of local government, and how it reflects around water, and why is water important to local government folks. So these are my stories, and there's a few of my slides in there. So the first one here is around why water, and I'm going to talk agriculture and drinking water are the first two. So, agriculture is important from a food security lens, to make sure that we have enough food for our communities. Finding that right balance of sharing the resources between, irrigation and how much water do we irrigate and offer in water license, and what are the impacts to the neighboring community. So here's a couple pictures here of a red pepper plant as well as a tomato farm, and my dog Ash is in the front of that photo here. So it's trying to find the balance between those two. And while local government isn't directly related to the agricultural sector, there is the ALR piece of it, as where you're being asked to subdivide within the ALR or remove properties from the ALR, and those impacts, and how does that fit into the overall land use planning and impacts for your community. The other piece on here is about drinking water, and Rob, you'll recognize Rob's in that picture as well. And this was the opening of the Windermere Water Treatment Plant a few years ago now, but this is about how important water is. It's a core function of local government, and it's around the quality and the quantity of drinking water. Is it surface water? Is it well water? How much does it cost? How big do you make it? Do you use water meters? What's the rate that you charge for water? Different rates for different sectors, be it industry, commercial, or residential, or flat rates as well. So there's, it's pretty important that drinking water is a key function for local government as well. So the next slide here is around ecosystems and power generation. So there's a couple slides here. So ecosystems is putting in those land use decisions around the development permit areas to protect setbacks on floodplains, or around high environmentally important areas of streams and wetlands and creek beds and that sort of thing, slope stability. Development permit areas is one of the tools that local governments can use to ensure that ecosystems are protected. And then there's also the power generation. And while local governments aren't specifically asked to approve power generation, because most times that's sort of a federal and provincial area, there is an opportunity for your position of influence in that, and how they're managed, and to ensure that the community needs are looked after as part of that. And a big part of that is they are linked with the salmon reintroduction project that is key for many folks in the basin as well. And then the next slide here is around recreation and snowpack. So when I talk about recreation, it can be, winter, summer, on the water, in the streams, or, it could be golfing, could be motorbiking, could be kayaking. And then the winter recreation is, high elevation, the ski hills, ensuring that we have access. I mean, that's one of the reasons why most people live here in the Kootenays, is because of the outdoor recreational opportunities. So we want to ensure that we have those for generations to come, but also to make sure that they're protected as well. And also, see here a picture of, in the Columbia Valley, there's a boat concert every year. And that's a picture from that, seeing how many folks were on the lake on that evening. So it is very popular recreation, and that does put pressure on the landscape around that. And also with snowpack it's about how the snow melts. We know that, every spring, at least in the East Kootenays, BC Hydro pulls you into a room and says, okay, here's the modeling, here's what we think is going to happen and how the snow is going to come down. And it can be, you can walk out of that room going, oh my goodness, we're going to flood, to, oh my goodness, we're going to have no water this year. So it can vary depending on the snowpack. And if it floods, there's all the impacts around that for, local governments of setting up sandbagging stations to, communicating with your constituents of being prepared for floods, oversizing culverts, debris flows, snowpack monitoring stations. And the other side of that is the drought, is when do you put water restrictions in, forest fires and smoke and everything that comes around that too. So you never know what the snowpack's going to bring, but it's going to have an impact onto our communities every year. Okay, so the next slide here is why. Why do we want to monitor water? So, as the management guru Peter Drucker famously said, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. If you don't measure, then how do you know what you are doing? This logic applies perfectly to water. Fresh water is the Earth's most important resource. 20% of the world's fresh water is in Canada, and 60% of Canadian watersheds are missing data needed in order to assess their health. So it's pretty important water monitoring about that. It supports data-driven decision-making. It leads to a sustainable approach to water management that can be built on sound scientific data and creates credibility and trust within your community. The water data builds on the foundational for climate adaptation and stewardship, and access to water is outlined in the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So there's lots of reasons why we should be collecting data and monitoring our watersheds. Okay, so here's our mandate. So Living Lakes Canada is a multi-award winning NGO that was founded right here in the Columbia Basin, specifically in the East Kootenays in the Columbia Valley. Today we have an office headquarters in Nelson, BC, with a growing team that largely works remotely. While the majority of our staff are based in the Kootenays, we also have team members located from coast to coast, Vancouver Island to Squamish to PEI in Newfoundland. A leader in the realm of community-based water monitoring for 2 decades, Living Lakes Canada facilitates collaboration around long-term protection of Canada's lakes, rivers, wetlands, and watersheds. We also connected to Living Lakes International, a global network with over 130 organizations that work to mitigate climate impacts on some of the most ecologically rich lakes, rivers, wetlands around the world. So as a leader in water stewardship, though Living Lakes Canada started as a local water project in 2004 to help save Lake Windermere after its burbot fisheries collapsed, by the time it was formally incorporated in 2017, it was delivering programs across the Kootenays, BC, and Canada. Today, Living Lakes has grown to become a core team of 26, delivering a range of programs across the country. You can see here, there's a list of our national and regional programs. We are an active member of the Federal Water Coalition that is leading the national dialogue to include community-based water monitoring into the new Canada Water Agency. We're also a voice at the table affecting new policy for BC's first Watershed Security Strategy Fund. And I'm going to give you a bit more overview of some of the projects that are in the Columbia Basin. So this next slide here is a snapshot of achievements. While there are too many accolades to list here, but here are some of the top honors to show you the influence and reach that Living Lakes has both provincially and federally. So there's the House of Commons Standing Committee on Science and Research, the Select Standing Committee on Finance and Government Services, Canada Water Agency Regional Freshwater Forum, featured in the Canada Water Magazine, and Water Steward of the Year NGO in 2017. So you see that it's both on a provincial, federal, affecting policy of government decisions, as well as raising our profile within the NGO sector and communities across the country. So the next slide here shows some of the statistics of our work in the last 3 years alone. So 145 lakes across Canada monitored, 12 of Canada's 25 major watersheds studied, 314 creeks and rivers sampled, 42 Indigenous partners trained and growing, and 750 plus volunteers in growing engaged in our work. While Living Lakes works to protect fresh water across the country, we continue to operate primarily in the Columbia Basin. So now that I'll review some of the community-based water monitoring programs that Living Lakes is delivering in the region, many of which are seen as models to be implemented in other regions across Canada. So this one here is applied reconciliation. So this continues to be the most important lens for our water stewardship work. The Applied Reconciliation Program works to build meaningful collaborations with First Nations around shared water values. The Applied Reconciliation team works with all other all of our programs hosted by Living Lakes Canada to ensure that reconciliation is consistently prioritized throughout every aspect of the organization. In the Columbia Basin, we established a data sharing agreement with the Shuswap Band and monitoring sites in collaboration with the Tobacco Plains Land, and we supported the purchase of equipment for the Lower Kootenay Band and for monitoring of the Goat River and the Creston Valley. We've had elder engagement sessions with the Shuswap and Aquiskunut First Nations around water priorities in the Columbia Valley, and hosted groundwater monitoring workshop with ACAM guardians and training and youth in Kimberley. And I know, Susan, you were part of those the sessions in the Columbia Valley last summer as well. I can see, yeah, your pictures there on the left. Okay. The next slide here is the youth and training. So the impacts of climate change have disproportionate effects on youth. Living Lakes Canada Youth Program brings together numerous youth-focused initiatives addressing the protection, restoration, and health of watersheds. The Center for Water Excellence delivers youth-specific programming to promote water literacy through educational programs and exploration into emerging technologies in this field, and support the implementation of stewardship programs. So here's a bunch of different examples of that's going on right now. So there's a fair bit of engagement, and this list is growing as well. So this next program is the Foreshore Inventory Management Planning, and you'll see there's a number of lakes there that are part of this program in the Kootenays here. So in Canada, lake shorelines are experiencing unparalleled development pressures resulting in damage to shoreline habitat, diversity, and aesthetic values. Foreshore Integrated Management Planning is a cumulative impact assessment tool that offers a solution for addressing these issues. By conducting lake surveys, maps assess the foreshore condition of the entire lake and establish foreshore development guidelines to support best management practice to protect species and ecosystems. Survey results can include an increase in retaining walls and docks and loss of natural environment. From 2019 to 2022, Living Lakes Canada mapped or remapped lakes in the Columbia Basin to assess the rate of change. And this is a list of those lakes that are included in the study. And all the findings and related reports are publicly available on the Columbia Basin Water Hub. And I know in my time with local government, this was a key color coding of the lake was very helpful when we were making land use decisions around the lake. So it was a tool that I found to be very effective. So the next one is biomonitoring. So our biomonitoring programs help assess freshwater health. Biomonitoring uses the bugs on the bottom of the streams and rivers as indicators to assess aquatic ecosystem health, because some are highly sensitive to pollutants and other impacts. And I'm just seeing a note here that Susan put in the chat here, just back to the FIMP report, is that the RDK has amended the management plans. This is for Columbia Lake and Lake Windermere to adopt the new FIMP plan. So that's an example of how the work that Living Lakes is doing is impacting and influencing local government decisions, and how it's a respected source of data. So Living Lakes Canada has been leading training courses for community-based water monitoring groups in the Columbia Basin, British Columbia, and Canada for 10 years. More recently, Living Lakes has partnered with the University of Guelph, with the WWF Canada in Environment, Climate Change Canada, to pilot new environmental DNA technology that has potential to provide faster, more accurate results. For this pilot program, the Columbia Basin was identified as a priority watershed, and Living Lakes Canada has held a number of local training courses, which are listed here. So this is an example of what started off in the Kootenays, has now expanded nationally. So the next slide is about the groundwater program, which is probably the most well-known. And groundwater is used in the Columbia Basin for domestic, agriculture, industrial, and commercial purposes. It is vital for maintaining healthy ecosystems. Careful management of groundwater is becoming increasingly important as populations continue to grow, demand increases, and climate change pressures intensify. The program partners with existing well owners, whether that be municipalities, local governments, First Nations, or private landowners or regional districts, to establish volunteer observation wells to monitor how groundwater levels change seasonally and from year to year. There are now 29 wells that are actively monitored as part of the Living Lakes Canada program. These wells complement the 6 provincial groundwater observation wells in the Columbia Basin that are operated by the BC government. So you can see here on the list that they're throughout the Kootenays. The province has 6 of them, and Living Lakes has added to that to complement the work that they're doing. And the next slide is around the high elevation. So temperatures at higher altitudes are accelerating at a faster rate than lower altitudes. As a result, high elevation ecosystems are more vulnerable and expected to experience climate change impacts more rapidly than lower elevations. Living Lakes Canada developed a high elevation monitoring program with the aim to understand how these ecosystems and watersheds are responding to climate change. Water quality and quantity are being studied as they are important to all biological communities. In 2022, Living Lakes piloted the high elevation monitoring program in Kokanee Glacier Provincial Park and Shannon Creek Lake in the Valhalla Range. The high elevation monitoring program is part of a larger Living Lakes Canada project, the Columbia Basin Water Monitoring Framework, which we'll talk about next, but that's just where those high elevation monitoring is. So the next slide is around the Columbia Basin Water Monitoring Framework. Some of you may be familiar with this. So the goal of the Columbia Basin Water Monitoring Framework is to track climate impacts on water. The data collected will support communities and decision makers in understanding their local watersheds in a warmer future in which water availability will fundamentally change, and how water might be allocated to support livelihoods and ecosystems. The project has received significant funding from the BC government. Local communities are engaged to ensure monitoring reflects community concerns and priorities within a scientific water balance approach. So this program was piloted in 3 sub-regions on the Columbia Basin in 2022. It says up there, the Columbia Valley, Elk Valley, and North Kootenay Lake, and is expanding into 2 new areas in 2023 with plans to expand into 9 more by 2030. So this is a longer term project. And I know that I spoke with a few folks about this, and this is where the stations, the location of the stations are combined with local priorities of the community as well. So with that, I'm going to finish talking about that, and I'm going to pass it over to Maggie, who is going to talk about the Columbia Basin Water Hub and that program, and then walk you through a demonstration of that. So Maggie, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Wendy. As I'm sure Wendy mentioned earlier, I'm calling in today from PEI, which is the traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq. So today I will be talking about the Columbia Basin Water Hub. It's fitting that it comes right after the highlight on the framework. The 2 projects are very closely tied, as I'm sure you'll see as we move through the tour in our slides today. So the Water Hub officially launched in March of 2021 and now hosts over 250 data sets from 45 different organizations. And these numbers continue to grow as we connect and collaborate with new contributors. Right there on the link we have, or on the slide, we have our visit cbwaterhub.ca, but I'm going to drop that in the chat later on, so don't worry if you miss it now. So let's talk about why do databases matter. Prior to the development of the Columbia Basin Water Hub, much of this water data was held on private computers or even on paper and was at risk of being lost. And the Water Hub was developed as a safe and place to secure and house this data. Could kind of call us data rescuers almost. The Water Hub provides decision makers, researchers, students, and professionals and the public access to a wide variety of data and information about the water in the region. And we work with each contributor to develop management plans and ensure that their data is stored and shared appropriately. Through operating this database, we have formed many new relationships with groups that are monitoring water in the region. I want to focus in a little bit about the Water Hub providing water data to decision makers such as yourself. We'd really like to see the Water Hub be used as a resource for you guys in your municipal and regional district governments. Your staff may find use of this. We have some really interesting tools and we're excited to offer that service. So who is contributing our data? We have a host of different data types from a host of different contributors. On this slide, you'll see a little bit of an overview of some of our contributors. We take data from stewardship groups, which are probably our main contributors, municipal governments, regional districts, academic organizations, industry and consultants, and independents. And then where is this data collected from? The Water Hub focuses on the Columbia Basin. Obviously, it's right there in our name. But we also host a few data sets that do expand the province, such as the FIMP data sets that Wendy was mentioning earlier. And we even are the official home of the National Lake Blitz data set as well, which is a community science project run by Living Lakes Canada. The map that you see right here is taken from the Water Hub's map search function. By being one of the central places for contributors in the region to upload their data, we find ourselves in a great position to start to visualize where we have an abundance of monitoring in the basin, and also importantly, where gaps exist in our monitoring efforts throughout the basin. So we're going to take a closer look at this tool once we're into the tour, and you'll get to see what I mean by visualizing those gaps a little bit better. So with that, we'll throw ourselves into the Water Hub tour. I'm going to drop the link into the chat for everyone. Please feel free to either follow along as we go, or you can always bookmark this link and take some time on your own to explore the Water Hub. And just give me a moment here. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, everyone able to see this? Great. All right, so welcome to the Columbia Basin Water Hub. Right away, we have several options along the top here to start exploring data. We're going to start off with data sets and just make our way through. Here you'll see that we have 298 data sets found, which is quite a bit more than the 250 I quoted earlier. So obviously our numbers have expanded quite a bit recently. You can filter this data based on the tags that we have available here, such as water temperature, stream, lake. We monitor these pretty closely so that we ensure that the data that's related to each tag really ties into that theme. We can filter by organizations along the side, the type of format. Like I mentioned earlier, we host all types of data. So whether it's Excel, link, PDF, GeoJSONs, PNG, audio, visual, if it's a format of data, we likely can host it here on the Water Hub. You can also look at our licenses and the groups, which allow us to look at regions of the Columbia Basin a little bit closer. These tie into the hydrologic regions from the monitoring framework. So Mid-Columbia, Kootenay, Upper Kootenay, and then data sets found in that specific area. I'm going to pop on over to organizations. So currently we have 45 organizations who contribute data to the Water Hub, and each of those organizations get their own profile page, which gives them a space to highlight some of their work, give a little synopsis about who they are, the work that they're doing, their values, and then all their data that they've added to the Water Hub. And then you can further search their data filtered by tags, formats, licenses, etc. So if you were to click here on a data set, it'll open you up into the data set, and then you'll see the resources. Think of our data sets as folders, and the resources inside are files. So we can have many different resources within a data set, as they're all likely related to, in this case, the Kennebasket Reservoir at Bush Harbor. If I click on water quality here, you can see that you're able to preview your data here, know what you're getting into before you download it. Download is a very simple function. Just hit that button and you're on your way. And then we also have some tools available to start to visualize this data a little bit better. So we can look at graphing the data that's available, which we've heard from a lot of our contributors and end users that this is a really powerful tool that they've used on a day-to-day basis in some cases. Now I'm going to highlight a couple of different types of data that we have on the Water Hub that you might find of interest. Let's go over to Brilliant Head Pump Foreshore inventory mapping. So this is an example of a GeoJSON piece of data, and it has populated a map here for us. This is a map of the FIMP survey that was done along the shoreline. And if we're to click on any segment here, we can see right here on the Water Hub the breakdown and the attributes associated with the segment. So shore type, the slope, land use, all that is available right here on the hub. No need to download the data or have access to different types of software to read mapping files. The other piece of data that I'll show you guys here is from our LLC groundwater monitoring program. We have developed a specific groundwater portal for LLC's groundwater monitoring program. It's called Depth to Water, and it is displayed here in the Water Hub. So this allows us to start to visualize some groundwater data a bit more and do some rudimentary analysis. You can see this is a really big data set that's gone on since 2008, which is great. So you can really start to pull some information from the data that you have here in this particular data set. And this Depth to Water portal is for all of our groundwater data that's currently on the Water Hub. Let's take a quick look here at the map search function. So just like I said, screenshot should look pretty familiar. We can start to zoom in on different areas and visualize what's going on when we talk about an abundance of monitoring versus maybe some data gaps. So if I come into Trail and Rosslyn area, I have a lot of different data types going on. Well, actually just a lot of stream monitoring, but whether it's a monitoring station, I think there's some temperature, different varieties here. We can see that there's quite a bit happening in this area. But if we come over to somewhere like Creston, we zoom in, there's not too much happening in comparison. There's a few groundwater wells, which is great, and 2 stream monitoring. But if you kind of explore the area around, you can see that maybe it could be a good idea to establish some more monitoring in these areas if you're thinking, or an organization is thinking about putting in some work. Finally, we have 2 more pages here, our about and our help page, which just give you a bit more context about the Columbia Basin Water Hub, how we operate our funders, as well as information about getting started with contributing data to the Water Hub. And we encourage everyone to share their data. We are stronger together. The transparency that comes with sharing data to something like the Water Hub really helps from an overall standpoint of looking at the state of the basin and what is happening with our water quality. All that data feeds into bigger models. And the more data and information we have, the more confidence we can have in those models and understand kind of where we're going when it comes to water security. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen here. And thank you.
Okay, thanks, thanks, Maggie. And you might be saying, why do you folks as an elected official need to look at, have an understanding of what the Water Hub is and all that data? Because generally speaking, you're not technical folks. But I think it's really important that you have sort of a broad overview that this information is here. There is the opportunity of one central place to house all this data, whether it be from a local government or a local water stewardship group, because the more data we have there, the easier it is for you folks as decision makers to be able to make those decisions, and that we can see over time the trends in our water management. So we as Living Lakes are going to be at AKBLG conference this coming in the end of April on the 90th annual AKBLG conference. And I was shocked that it's been 90 years, but it's been around a long time. So that's wonderful. And we're going to be doing a presentation on water supply for community climate adaptation. And that's on Friday, the 21st at 3:50 to 4:20. So I'm hoping that we'll see some familiar and friendly faces at that. And then the final slide here is just about some contact details from myself and Maggie. Nicole's not on there, but we always know how to get a hold of Nicole. And this QR code, if you wanted to scan that, and you can sign up for the newsletter and for all the social media sites that Living Lakes has. And it's a quick access to everything, everything Living Lakes as well on there too. It's actually a pretty unique and very easy to use tool.